Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is my friend Dan Masters. Dan, how are you today?
No, I'm doing great. Thanks for the invite tonight.
Oh, I'm super excited because we're getting to get to talk about
Oh,
this
good
really cool
heavens.
new book, Hell by the Acre. Here, I'll show it off this way too. But I wanted to hold it this way. This is a nice, hefty book. This is like a work of substance here. It weighs a
Yeah,
lot. So,
610 pages or so of text, and it's kind of crazy you think about it. The book is right around 250,000 words, a little less than that. The first draft was 315,000, so it's been given a few haircuts to even get down to the bulk that you have there.
so this is a narrative history of the Stones River campaign, anniversary of which is coming up here. So I thought it'd be a great time for us to talk about this. And this is really the first comprehensive narrative history of this battle in a while. This is an
Yeah,
overlooked battle. Tell me about that.
the really the last author that it really tackled it in depth was Larry Daniel back around 2012. And really, most of the previous treatments would be more of what I call kind of a top-down view of the campaign, really looking at it from the perspective of political leaders and generals and whatnot. And as much as I enjoyed those books, all of my ancestors were just men in the ranks. I had three ancestors at Stones River. All three of them were privates. One of them was mortally wounded in the battle. And for me, I was always like, well, what was their experience? Like, how did they experience the Battle of Stones River really at the ground level? So as we're kind of thinking about, how to explain and how to explore this campaign, really, I wanted to take, we'll say, familiar events. I mean, the story of the Stones River campaign has been told before, but to look at it from a different perspective. I mean, history has all sorts of facets to it. And this one, it really hadn't been explored very much. So the goal became, how can we tell this story really through the prism of the enlisted men, and how does that change our perception of the battle?
Mhm.
And I guess that's up for the readers to decide what they think of that. It was certainly a very enjoyable experience for me. It has a different feel than you would say a traditional campaign history, because it's very much the men in the ranks telling you what that experience was like.
Now that's very much in line with kind of your daily Civil War bread and butter. I mean, your blog where you concentrate on primary sources from soldiers in the ranks and what they're doing, particularly out there in the Western theater. You have spent a lot of time in the ranks in your work. For folks who might not be familiar with that aspect of your career, we'll get back to the book in a second, but I want to kind of plug your blog a little bit and the great work that you do
Well,
sharing
thank
those
you.
soldier voices. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I'm going to give John Banks all the credit for this, for at least inspiring the blog in the first place. So back in, it's about 2016, I was in a local library here and literally stumbled across a memoir written by a member of the 11th Connecticut. Now, I live in northwestern Ohio. We don't have a whole lot of, Eastern Theater regiments in our area. And this guy was he lived in Connecticut at the time and then wrote this memoir like in the 1920s. And it was just tucked away in a little folder in this local history room. And I dug it out, and he's got like 6 pages where he's writing about the Battle of Antietam. And of course, he was a private. I think he was in Company A, the 11th Connecticut. So I started doing some research about him because I'm not overly familiar with the regiment, and I stumbled across John's blog. And so I ended up sharing that memoir with him, and I really, really loved his blog. And it started thinking, it's like, it'd be kind of cool to do something like this, maybe featuring Ohio's troops in the Civil War. So that's kind of what started it. It has grown much beyond that since, but once again, so much finding these original letters, a lot of times in newspapers or in obscure publications, and so much of it is like, when I find something that like rings a bell for me, I want to share it.
Yeah.
So it makes it much easier for other historians to find this stuff, because now they're not digging through hundreds of issues of newspapers to kind of find the kind of the creme de la creme. They're kind of out there. And at last count, we're at 944 blog posts,
Wow. Wow.
which is, yeah, pretty crazy. I think I'm starting to wind down a little bit. I'm not publishing quite as often as I used to, but there is just it's something I love doing. And there is so much good raw material out there. Um, every state had newspapers, and a lot of them published soldiers' letters. And you start digging through, and you just find some amazing content.
That's my favorite source for finding primary sources is the guy who wrote home to his mom, and then his mom takes the letter down to the newspaper and they print it.
Right.
And I mean, you're getting
Right.
really raw, unfiltered stuff from the battlefield there,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
One
So,
of the things also that I find so fascinating, especially from the enlisted men, and even some of the company level officers, they often don't have as much of an agenda. They tend to be, pretty plain spoken. Um, and for me too, I also like using like those primary sources from the ranks to kind of ground truth what the OR says happened. The colonel of the regiment describes an action in a certain way. How did his subordinates view it? And sometimes you end up finding out, well, the colonel was less than honest in describing what happened here, because there might be something that reflected unfavorably upon him or his regiment. And the enlisted men tend to be a little more, well, it was the way it was. And so it kind of helps. To me, it helps proof out the ORs a little bit, and sometimes smokes out some of the agendas that are they're lying within. That if you're not aware that they're there, you would just accept it. Oh, this is the official record. This must be correct, right?
right.
Not always.
Yeah. I like the term you used a few minutes ago. If it rings your bell, you wanted to share it. And, it's one of the things I always tell my writing students is like, if it's going to be interesting to you, you'll be able to make it interesting to your readers. But like, and so for you, you find these accounts, they speak to you. So, the assumption there is they're going to speak to other people too, so that's, I think, a pretty neat way of sifting through these because gosh, other people are going to find those things interesting
Yeah,
because you do.
and once you kind of get into, I would call gutting a newspaper. I actually had a new one the other night that I worked on, the St. Joseph Valley Register in South Bend, Indiana. Spent a few hours digging through that. You just kind of develop a process, and you just know when you're reading through, okay, in October of 1862, I'm going to see letters about the Battle of Corinth, maybe Perryville. In January 63 is when I'm going to find the Stones River stuff. So you just kind of start to know what to expect, but you never know what you're going to find until you get in. It's almost like, for me, it was like Christmas. I found a new letter the other night from a private in the Ninth Indiana who's writing about, and I remember you guys with the American Battlefield Trust did that great video at the Round Forest. Well,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
guy was in the Round Forest describing what that action, what it was like, and how after firing 52 shots, he was wounded, and he describes that experience. And he was writing home to his wife. So, I mean, actually, of course, it turns into a new rabbit hole because I want to find out who this guy is. And found a picture of him online with his second wife, and then he moved to Nebraska. And I mean, it was just, you just get sucked into this stuff. And that's what's really, to me, what's so endlessly joyful about the experiences. As much as we may think we know, there's always aspects of the conflict I haven't explored. I'm by no means an expert on the Eastern Theater. I haven't studied a lot of Grant's Overland Campaign. Someday that will ring my bell and I'll dig into that. Right now, for the last 15, 20 years, it's been Stones River and the Western Theater. And given that I have that family connection, I don't know if that's ever going to change. Really, I go back far enough. This fascination with the Civil War didn't start for me as a child. It wasn't until the late 90s, when I was in my early 20s, my grandmother was visiting, and she hands me this Civil War discharge certificate. And she says, I know we're related to this guy, but I don't know how. Well, it turns out it was my third great grandfather, her second great grandfather, who served in the 1st Ohio Cavalry. So as I'm starting to learn about who this guy is and what our connection to the Civil War is, of course, I want to know more and more and more. And here we are, almost 30 years later with a 600-page book under our belt and a blog and all these other things. So it's just kind of interesting how those things just kind of organically develop over time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what your Civil War origin story was because I always found those pretty fascinating.
Yeah,
And sort of
and
came
I've
out of
got
nowhere.
the certificate is an honored place on my desk, so I,
Yeah.
I, I keep that pretty close at hand. One of the things I've always, of course, anybody who is researching their ancestor in the Civil War, you want to find a letter, something that they wrote. I've been looking for 30 years, Chris. I haven't found a single thing yet.
Um,
I'm gonna keep looking, but yeah, there's just, I found lots of great other stuff for
I
other
was going to
people's
say
grandpas, but not so much for my own.
you certainly found a lot of other voices for sure.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Round Forest a second ago, which also
Mhm.
is known as Hell's Half Acre. You've called the book Hell by the Acre. So you have promoted from the half acre to the full acre here.
Mhm.
And so I'm kind of curious as to where the name of the book came from.
Okay. So the origin of the book's title actually ties back to my fourth grade uncle, James McLargan, who was mortally wounded at Stones River. He was in the 21st Ohio. And when they were fighting in the Cedars down by tour stop number 2, uh, their colonel, Lieutenant Colonel James Niebling of Finley, this is really the first time the regiment's under serious fire. And he's walking back and forth behind the lines, and he keeps yelling out to the boys, "Give them hell by the acre, boys, give them hell by the acre." And that's something they always remembered him by. A couple of years ago, I had the honor, and I do consider it quite an honor, to hold the sword that Colonel Niebling was waving when
Oh,
he
wow.
was telling the boys that it's in the hands of a private collector. And that was quite a thrill. But to me, it was such an apt description of what Stones River was. I mean, it was just some of the most brutal fighting yet seen in the war. And I think I make the argument in the introduction. Rivals Antietam is the bloodiest 12 hours in American history, and it was fought with 40,000 less men.
Uh, yeah. Well, and then, of course, proportionately, as far as casualties for the army, they lose a higher proportion of the armies than any place else during the war. I mean,
Yeah,
so
1 out of 3.
yeah, so I mean that's a tremendous amount of casualties if you think about that.
Yeah.
So now Stones River often gets forgotten about or overlooked. So give us a quick overview of Stones River as you understand it.
So brief synopsis of the campaign. So really, it's set in late December of 1862, location about 30 miles southeast of Nashville, Tennessee. So it's in Middle Tennessee. The context of when Stones River occurs is very important. In late 1862, the Lincoln administration sends out directives to the commanders of all its armies that they expect them to basically launch a broad offensive against the Confederacy. A couple of things that were behind that. Lincoln had great concerns about British Parliament coming into session in January. He didn't want there to be any perception that the Union was on the retreat. He was very concerned about potential English intervention in the war. So that was a factor. Of course, the election of 1862 went by and large to the Democrats, so you have kind of a shifting of power. There's concerns that the Union is losing the war, and we have the Emancipation Proclamation going into effect on January 1st. Kind of hard for that to have a lot of teeth on the heels of a bunch of defeats. So the idea was to go out there and really kind of put some military oomph behind this proclamation. Um, Stones River ends up being the only federal victory of this period. Fredericksburg, as you're very familiar with, was a catastrophe for the Union Army. In the far west, U.S. Grant has really a two-prong expedition to invade Mississippi. There's a land-borne expedition that he leads, and then there's a waterborne expedition that Tecumseh Sherman leads down to Chickasaw Bayou. And that's been called the Fredericksburg in the West. It was fought almost in the same, I think it was fought December 29th, but it occurred over several days, almost the same time as Stones River. It was a smaller scale Fredericksburg. It was another Union defeat. So the Federal Army doesn't look too good here at the end of the year. So it's really kind of falls to Rosecrans and his army to secure a victory. The army marches out, or Rosecrans' army marches out on December 26th. Takes them about 4 days to get to Murfreesboro, and General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee is there waiting for them. Bragg launches a surprise assault on the Union right on the morning of the 31st. It's wildly successful. And in the course of the fighting, the Union line, which was about 3 miles long and almost in a semi-straight line, ends up being almost folded up upon itself like a jackknife. And by the end of the day, Bragg has moved Rosecrans. He's not been able to move him off the Nashville Pike, but he's got him almost concentrated into a big block. But in so doing, he'd pretty much gutted his army. And the balance of the fighting was really a matter of um, Rosecrans' determination to hold on until he had more reinforcements so he could launch his own assault, and Bragg coming up with, shall we say, increasingly desperate ways to convince Rosecrans to leave. And that's what culminates in this grand attack that Breckinridge stages on the night or the early evening hours of January 2nd, 1863. The kind of one very famous for the sacrifice of the Orphan Brigade and whatnot. Of course, that attack fails. Rosecrans continues to hold his ground. And the following day, Bragg determines that he cannot hold on to his position at Murfreesboro any longer, and the army retreats under the cover of darkness that night. It is one of the bloodiest clashes of the war. I would argue it's the second bloodiest in the Western theater. By the time it's over, there's 25,000 casualties, which is staggering.
Yeah.
A future book will have those casualties spelled out name by name, where I think we have about 98% of the casualties for both armies spelled out on an individual basis. So we're looking forward to getting that out here in the future.
Wow. Wow. So a couple things there. Rosecrans, relatively new to command, and when he's told go, he's under this political pressure because Lincoln has these political considerations, and he's come to command because his predecessor Don Carlos Buell got fired for not going, basically.
Right.
So,
Right.
so put me in Rosecrans's shoes for a second. He's taken over this army. He's got all of this pressure around him, and he's having to forge into an area that he doesn't really quite know what he's marching into.
Right, right. And for Rosecrans, there was a couple of things that kind of triggered his decision when to go. Now, understand, Rosie was under pressure from the Lincoln administration to march right into Eastern Tennessee. That's really what they wanted him to do. And Buell, a lot of the reason Buell was removed from command was because when the administration strongly hinted that's where he needed to go after the Battle of Perryville, Buell's like, no, this is not the way to get there. I can't support my army. He throws out a million excuses why he can't do it. And Washington had already fired the guy once and had threatened to fire him at least one time before that. Finally just said, okay, we're done, and replaced him with Rosecrans. Rosecrans is no pushover either. He and Halleck get into quite the duel of letters for a while. And eventually Rosecrans essentially tells Halleck, well, if you're going to relieve me, just do it. To any threats of being removed, I'm insensible. And finally, Halleck backs down. It takes him a little while to get to that point. But when Rosecrans is ready to move, it's right around Christmas time. The key he needed to do two things. The Federal Army had been on half rations for most of the summer, the Army of Ohio, which was Buell's command. And in part because the Confederacy had just racked the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. So that needed to be repaired. He needed to build up a stock of supplies. By about the middle of December, he's managed to do that. The second thing he is concerned about is the Confederate cavalry forces way outnumber his. And he's very concerned that if he embarks on any kind of offensive, the Confederate cavalry will basically destroy his rear and destroy his supplies, and then they'll be in a real fix. Right around a week or so before Christmas, our good friend John Hunt Morgan decides that it's time to embark on another raid into Kentucky. And at the same time, Nathan Bedford Forrest moves off into western Tennessee with another cavalry force. Well, one of the things that surprised me was how openly these were discussed in the Confederate press. And of course, we always have the pickets exchanging newspapers. Well, the officers, at Rosecrans headquarters are naturally very interested in getting their hands on, the Murfreesboro newspapers and, the Chattanooga Daily Rebel, because it has that kind of information in there. So they learned that, several thousand of these Confederate cavalry apparently are going to be on the move. And Rosecrans decided this is the time to, we need to move forward. This is the time to do it.
Now it's funny you talk about Rosecrans sort of being concerned about being able to supply his army and Buell prior to that. That's something that really is on Rosecrans's mind all the way to the Tullahoma campaign.
Oh, constantly.
You
In the Western theater, the sheer distances involved are staggering. I mean, the distance from Louisville to Nashville, something on the order of 180 miles. It's another, 120 or so to Chattanooga. So from your main supply depot on the Ohio River at Louisville to Chattanooga is, the better part of 300 miles.
Yeah.
All of that over a single track railroad, which, by the way, goes through tunnels and over trestles. Earlier in the summer, Morgan had collapsed the tunnel at Gallatin, which took months to clear out. Doesn't take a whole lot to burn a wooden railroad trestle covered with pine tar and things like this. So, I mean, they had it really, the federal force in earlier part of 1862 wasn't big enough to both engage in offensive operations in the Deep South and protect its supply base. By the end of 1862, of course, we've enlisted 300,000 more volunteers. The Federal Army in the theater is much, much larger, and a much larger percentage of them are devoted to protecting railroad lines and bridges and things of that nature. So the supply situation is more secure by the end of 1862 than it was several months earlier, simply because they had a lot more men to deploy on that mission.
Now, give me your assessment of Rosie's antagonist, Braxton Bragg, who is one of those guys that we love to make fun of. We love to hate. His men love to hate him. What's your assessment of him as you got to spend time with him on this book?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with General Bragg, a very complex individual. There's a lot of things in General Bragg's character that I think are very laudatory. He was totally devoted to this cause. He would work himself to a frazzle. The main knock on Braxton Bragg is his ability to make enemies was legion. He tended to have a pretty, he was very unsparing of himself and tended to be very unsparing of others. Was a man that would hold a grudge. I'm thinking, I've been in industry now for 30 years and I've worked for, I can't tell you how many different plant managers and leaders and whatnot. And I think of Bragg in that context, and I think he's the guy that gets results, but his team hates him as they're doing it because he's just a kind of a brutal a character. He's got some problems by this time, by the end of 1862. Of course, he'd taken over command of the army in June of 62 from Beauregard. He didn't want the job, but it was given to him anyway. And he really, when you look at the whole, the catalog of who commanded this Western Confederate Army, one would argue that with Bragg, they got farther north than they did with anybody else. Mm-hmm. I mean, they did make it all the way up into the northern reaches of Kentucky that summer of 1862. It's certainly Joe Johnston never made much progress, and John Bell Hood tried to and kind of ran into a lot of problems at Franklin and Nashville. Albert Sidney Johnston, of course, had started off in Kentucky, but his record is one really more of retreat. So, Bragg, in the one sense, is kind of taking this army to heights that no one else did, but the expectations were also very high, and he failed to live up to them. His biggest personal problem was that he tended to say very harsh things about his subordinates, and he wasn't exactly private about doing so. I think I recount in the book where he's basically, calling out, lying out his polk is, useless. Well, that's all fine, well, and good in the privacy of talking with your staff members, but he's doing this in a public manner to one of his key subordinates. And I think Richard Taylor records this story, General Richard Taylor, as he's going to Louisiana. And he pulls Bragg aside and says, well, Polk's this bad. Who are you going to get to replace him? I think that Taylor might have been angling for the command a little bit. And Bragg's like, well, this is the government's fault. They won't send me anybody. I'm not replacing him at all. And Taylor's like, you can't expect your subordinates to perform well for you when you behave like this.
Yeah.
And I think he was able to say that because Richard Taylor, of course, was Zachary Taylor's son, and Bragg had served under Zachary Taylor and known him during the Mexican War. So maybe he gave him a little more license. But like he said, the high command of the Army of Tennessee by this time is starting to have some serious qualms with Mr. Bragg. The way the Battle of Stones River ends, just it really blows up and gets really ugly after the battle. But they said, a very complex individual, an easy man to hate, and I think probably unfairly blamed for a lot of things that happened. He had some pretty challenging subordinates too. I mean, having to go to war with Leonidas Polk as your right hand man is a cross to bear.
In several different ways.
In several different,
as the Episcopal bishop.
Yeah,
Right?
think about it. Yeah.
So, one of your specialties is looking at things from the soldier's point of view. So, how do the soldiers look at their commanders?
Well, Rosie was new into command at this point, but had made a very favorable early impression. One of the things that the soldiers were really impressed with Rosie, he did not. West Point kind of trains that officers and men are supposed to have a certain distance. And Rosie he had no qualms. If he was out inspecting the lines, he would sit there and shoot the breeze with the corporals and the privates like he was another one of them. Of course, they knew he was not, but he had a very familiar style with the enlisted men. That didn't set altogether well with some of the other West Point trained officers in there. I know William Babcock Hazen in particular had some, shall we say, issues with Rosie's approach. But the enlisted men, by and large, appreciate Rosecrans' concern for their welfare, his approachability. He was a fairly strict disciplinarian, but they seemed to respond well to it. Now, when Buell tried to instill this kind of discipline over the summer, the Army howled and wrote letters by the bushel back to their home folks complaining about how Buell was in sympathy with the rebels. They had no such concerns about Rosie. Braxton Bragg is a more difficult one to gauge. And part of the reason why is when you think of the historiography of the Army of Tennessee, what's the one book that stands out? Sam Watkins' Company H.
Yeah.
Everyone that's read about the Western Confederacy has read this book. And of course, Watkins, being part of the 1st Tennessee, is a virulent anti-Bragg man. People get the sense that, oh, well, if that's what Watkins says, then the whole Army thought that. No, not quite. There were significant portions of the Army that had served under Bragg down in Pensacola and down in the Gulf Coast that had a much more favorable view of him and would maintain that view through the end of his term. Mm-hmm. So the view that I'm not going to say that Bragg wasn't tyrannical at times and was an extraordinarily difficult individual to maybe soldier under, but there were lots of men that appreciated what he did for them. And he was a good feeder. I mean, he was generally, his logistics were in pretty good condition. The men they had the sense that Bragg was willing to fight for them. I mean, he wasn't a pushover. But likewise, usually what overwhelmed that was, they'd have these interactions with him on a march, and he would pop off at somebody, and of course that story would make its way up and down the line, and by and large, I think the Southern soldiers had a very mixed view of him. Rosecrans at this point, Rosecrans, I say, was almost universally beloved at this point. That would soften a bit over time, but even after the disaster at Chickamauga, by and large, the men of the Army of the Cumberland did not blame Rosecrans for that failure. They didn't blame him for the defeat. They were actually a little more irritated with Grant that he had removed him. So yeah, there's some partisanship that goes on afterwards. But so yeah, very mixed at this point for General Bragg.
So how hard was it for you to sift through people's opinions of Bragg, knowing how the historiography evolves and how the mythology around Braxton Bragg evolves, knowing that even by the time Stones River is going on, that's colored by events from Perryville just a couple
Right.
months earlier, and
I
that's
tried to stick
fertile.
as much as possible with things written in the period. A lot of post-war writing, as you said, kind of gets colored by later events. The thinking, a soldier that might have served under him at Stones River and then was in that disaster on top of Missionary Ridge, that largely blamed Bragg for that situation. What they write about him, it's going to change. I would expect it to change. So really, what I try to do is try to stick with things that were written, between November of '62 and February '63 to kind of gauge. He did lose a fair amount of respect with the men after they retreated from Stones River. The Confederate Army was absolutely convinced that they won the Battle of Stones River. The men in the ranks looked at this is like, this is like Perryville all over again. We almost, we nearly ran the Yankees off the field, and here we are retreating again. And there was a lot of frustration about that. And Bragg, as commander in chief that made that decision, comes in for the flak. Enlisted men did not understand how badly the Army had been hurt and why Bragg had made the decision to retreat when he did, but they knew that they had fought their hearts out. And apparently, I mean, they had great success. They'd captured 29 cannon, a half dozen flags, had driven the Federal Army at least 2 miles, and here we are retreating again. Who's responsible for that? It's not me. I did my job in the ranks. It must be the higher echelon officers. So Bragg ends up taking it on the chin, and the burden of command rests with him.
Right, right. So and particularly on the heels of Perryville, it's sort of like one of those, oh geez, Bragg again snatches defeat from the jaws of victory.
Yeah, yep.
So what's your final assessment? We're skipping ahead to the end of the battle here, but like, what's your assessment? They both bloody each other. Rosecrans does hold the field. Bragg is the one who voluntarily chooses to leave the field.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a draw? Is it a win for one side or the other? How do you
We
parse that?
can't argue that it's a Confederate victory because it was not. It was most certainly a federal victory, but a federal victory by the narrowest of margins. I think, as I lay out in one of the last chapters in the book, specifically around Breckinridge's assault. Breckinridge's assault achieves the goal that Bragg set out for them. They were supposed to drive 2 Federal brigades off of Beatty's Ridge. They accomplished that mission within 20 minutes of stepping off of Wayne's Hill. The problem was they overran the objective, and in so doing, they get themselves down into the lowlands near the river, which is under all these Federal guns, and take enormous casualties. Of course, John Miller's countercharge across the river helps compel that along. So in that sense, I mean, I walked away. It was like so many of our Civil War battles. The two armies beat themselves to a pulp, and either side could argue that they had won afterwards. I think in this case, since generally speaking, when an army holds the field, they're considered the victor. But I don't know that it's that easy. My respect for the Confederate fighting soldier grew exponentially as I read this book. Some of the descriptions they give, imagine charging a full battery of cannon that are double shotted with canister and only 200 yards away. I just cannot imagine the courage it took to not only do that, but to do so repeatedly. The Federal position in the Round Forest was struck 5 separate times. Now, I can understand the first time you're all full of gusto and, yeah, we're just going to run these Yankees right off the field. But think about the courage it took for maybe Daniel Adams' brigade, which was the third assault, when the ground in front of you is carpeted with the remnants of 2 brigades that had already tried to take this position. Think of the stones that it takes to, form yourself into line, tuck yourself up next to your partner and shoulder your musket and say, well, we're going to take them this time. Of course they didn't, but to me, just putting myself in the place of the men that had to make those charges, like I fully disagree with the cause they were fighting for, but by God, I can't but admire their courage.
Yeah. You talk about how the armies had beaten each other to pulps. Uh, Bragg withdraws, and I do think it's quite telling that it takes Rosecrans months before he can pursue. I mean,
Yeah,
like he's that beaten up, and his supply issues are that grave that it takes him a long time to recover from the battle.
right. And weather certainly plays a part here too. I mean, you look at the history of the Civil War. 1861, there's really no major significant battles in the wintertime. We get to the end of 1863, and the armies kind of go on hiatus for a period of time. I mean, maneuvering an army in the mud and snow of winter is just it's really challenging. And I think that played a big role too. Granted, the armies also had lost a third of their numbers. Um, yeah, you kind of have this period. The first 5 months or so of 1863 are relatively quiet, east and west.
Yeah.
We of course we have Burnside's Mud March, which ends his tenure as commander of the Army of the Potomac. But until Chancellorsville, I don't call it a dead period, but really, when you think about, I almost pause and think how heavily the armies had suffered in these
Mhm.
winter campaigns. I wonder if there might have been a lesson learned, like, okay, maybe these aren't such a good idea when the weather is this bad. And like I said, until you get down to the end of 1864, you've got, of course, Sherman marching off to the sea, but he's also much further south.
Yeah.
The fall weather in central Georgia isn't quite as maybe challenging as it is in central Virginia or in Tennessee. So
Yeah. So as you were writing about this battle, was there a particular facet or phase or component or location that particularly captured your imagination as you were writing?
a couple of them. I'm utterly fascinated with the opening moments of the battle. Unfortunately, you go to Stones River today, as you have traveled there before. Lots of growth, lots of development. The very opening scene of the battle is at the intersection of what is today Gresham Lane and Tennessee 96. I don't recommend anyone like try to go into the middle of that intersection to try to have a moment. You'll get run over. Um, but there's just all sorts of development all around that. But for me, that is one of the most poignant moments. I actually have a couple of relics here. I'm not sure if they're going to show up on the camera real well. But this is Captain Warren Parker Edgerton. I have a CDV of him. He's kind of my favorite battery commander. Well, he was commanding the Federal battery that was at that critical point
Oh, yeah.
at the very opening of the battle, and ended up being wounded multiple times and captured with his entire battery that morning. One of the soldiers that was with him, this is really one of my prized possessions. This is Private Julius Waite, who was also in battery, who was killed in action, like in the opening shots of the battle.
Mm.
So I kept these, pretty close on hand as I was writing the book, because it just remind who am I writing this for? Of course I'm writing it for a modern audience, but really writing it to connect with these men and their experiences. To me, that's a poignant place. Another one that I don't think quite gets the maybe the press or the visitation that it should is if you go to tour stop number 2, and there's McFadden Lane that runs straight south down to what was then called the Wilkinson Pike. If you go to the end of that road and then go out into that field, that's where Patton Anderson's Mississippi Brigade suffered some of the heaviest casualties of the battle. I would offer there's not just one Hell's Half Acre or one Mississippian's Half Acre at Stones River. There are multiple. And that's another one that, as I said, I don't think there's any signage or marking out there. But the casualties, I'm thinking the 29th and 30th Mississippi made this one attack, and I think one regiment lost. They both lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 men in about half an hour.
Wow.
And it is over a very small patch of ground. But as I said, it's not really noted today. Of course, anything in the Cedars. I remember first time I went through there, you can find yourself lost pretty quick,
Yeah.
and that's a cool. It's a scary feeling and a cool feeling at the same time, because That's what those soldiers felt, especially Negley's division, as they were surrounded on three sides in trying to get out of that forest. So that one always speaks to me. Of course, going to McFadden's Ford is pretty.
Yeah.
I wish there wasn't so much development right across the rivers. You could kind of see more of what there was. But yeah, and the Round Forest. Um, I get kind of emotional at the National Cemetery, in particular if you go a little south of the cemetery. There's that kind of open scrub field.
Yeah.
That's where Julius Garrichet, who was Rosecrans' chief of staff, was decapitated at Rosecrans' side. You can go. I mean, it's just things like that. You read enough about the battle, and it's kind of hard to not get a little emotionally invested into it, and just kind of take these men's stories into your heart.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, I always find the slaughter pen to be just a surreal landscape because those limestone
Oh
formations that
goodness.
you just don't see on other battlefields, and you think, gosh, guys trying to fight through that and move through that, and it
They
just,
say it looks like a great place to defend, but a hell of a place to try to get out of.
yeah. Yeah. I'm always struck, and maybe because we're sort of in the holiday season as we're having this conversation. But I'm always struck by that battle of the bands that happens before
Mhm,
the battle actually erupts the night before.
mhm.
And these are men who know that combat is coming. They're nervous, they're excited, they're missing home, and then the bands from both sides strike up and they kind of have this competition that really resonates strongly and
Mhm.
deeply across the battlefield.
And I hate to poke holes in that myth,
Yeah.
but I believe it may be a myth. The source of that story is actual Samuel C.A., who was a comrade of Sam Watkins in the 1st Tennessee Infantry. As I said, I think I have 4 bankers boxes worth of raw material on this battle. I have yet to see a single contemporary description of that event,
Okay. Yeah.
not a
Okay.
single one. Sam C.A. remembers it in 1885 in a article he did for Southern Bivouac, 85 or 86. I can't definitively say it didn't happen. It's a beautiful story. I
Yeah. Right.
wish it happened. I wish I could find someone who wrote about it the week after.
Yeah.
But yeah, the story really, is as the two armies came into close proximity to one another on December 30th. Of course, one of the ways that the army ends its day, it usually has some field music, of course, sounding a reveille, and sometimes the bands will pick up patriotic airs. And the story was that I don't know which band started it, but one band in one army or the other began playing patriotic airs. Yankee Doodle answered by Dixie, and so on and so forth. And they end up one band starts picking up the strains of Home Sweet Home, and obviously a nonpartisan song that both armies adore, and both bands pick it up, and that's kind of how the battle, how the last night before the battle ends. Like I said, it's a beautiful story. I'm a little skeptical whether it really
Yeah.
happened that way, but I have nothing to say it absolutely didn't. But I would really, if a reader or listener out there has contemporary evidence, I would love to see it. A diary, a letter, something. I mean, it wasn't even reported in any of the newspaper accounts. So I'm like, I want to believe it, but I
Yeah, no,
need to
see,
see it.
that's great. See, I learned something, and that jumped out at me because, of course, the park has a wayside about it. And
Mm-hmm.
when I read it, and I'm like, the same thing happened at Spotsylvania on the 10th of May,
Oh, okay.
and lots of contemporaneous accounts about it. And so I was like, hey, this happened at Spotsy. So that's kind of why it connected with me so much. And um, but to me, it's always one of those
It's a
things that,
beautiful story because it to me, the context of when CA wrote that was in the 1880s, when we're kind of having this reconciliation between the veterans. So to me, it's emblematic of a coming together. I mean, it's really what it's about. It's about the two armies coming together, which was a goal in the 1880s. Well, let's set all these, this nastiness from 20 years aside, and try to move forward as a new nation. So I look at the story kind of in that prism, and thinking that, maybe that's, then again, he might have been exactly right, and that's how it was. Like I said, it's a beautiful story. I will love to be proved wrong in my contention, but I'm a little skeptical.
that's awesome though. So, as we head into the home stretch here, how do you assess the overall importance and impact of Stones River?
Stones River I think it might have been Bruce Catton that wrote this back in the 1960s, but the quote I remember seeing was few battles cost more or meant less. And I think that kind of judgment is kind of colored why there's not been a ton of works on the battle. There's just kind of this perception that was just a lot of meaningless carnage. I obviously disagree with that. I wouldn't have spent so many years working on the book if I agreed with the assessment. Um, I look at Stones River, it's important in the context in which it occurred. Granted, the battle did not return large swaths of land to federal control, though it did help secure a good portion of Middle Tennessee. What it did do was it was the sole federal victory in a sea of federal defeats. Um, the anti-war effort was starting to build in the North. As I said, the Lincoln administration had multiple concerns, with English or French recognition of the Confederacy, needing to have some military teeth behind the Emancipation Proclamation, and I think about what would the condition of the nation been had Stones River been a defeat? What if Breckinridge's attack? What if they didn't overrun their objective and they plunked down on top of Beatty's Ridge, and then the next morning they're up there with 50 cannon and a full entrenched Confederate division, basically daring Rosecrans to charge across Stones River and drive them off. I don't think Rosecrans does it. I think he packs his bags and goes back to Nashville. It was that close.
Wow.
Um, where would the nation be had Stones River been a defeat? I don't know where that puts us in vis-a-vis the English Parliament in January, because now they're looking across the ocean and going, wow, the Union's taken a shellacking from pillar to post. Maybe the Confederacy does have a viable nation here. Maybe we really need to rethink this. What's it do to the Emancipation Proclamation? It's in effect as the battle is occurring. How much teeth does it have? How much confidence do people put in that if the armies are just, you know, failing from coast to coast? And Lincoln himself, writing months later to Rosecrans. Of course, Rosecrans, as 1863 develops, Rosecrans develops a frostier and more contentious relationship with his superiors, Halleck and Stanton in particular, but also with Lincoln. And Lincoln sends him a letter in August of 1863 to try to smooth some ruffled feathers. And he says, I can never forget, well, I remember anything. At the end of last year, you gave us a hard-earned victory that had there been a defeat and said, I don't think the nation could have lived over. So Lincoln's viewing is like, had we lost at Stones River, I might have lost the cause. And that's what he's writing to Rosecrans. So I think from that perspective, yeah, it is extraordinarily bloody and it is a lot of carnage. But when you think about it, so many of these battles that were fought in this middle period of the war didn't seem to decide a whole lot. Chancellorsville is a great example. These two enormous armies slugged it out for the better part of a week, and at the end of the week, they're where they started.
No.
And
And super frustrating for
what
me.
was
Yeah.
decided? Not a whole lot. So the Stones River in that perspective is hardly unique, and I think so many of these battles, there's a reason there's not a dozen decisive battles in a war. There's usually only a couple that are, and even those may be a bit overstated. One would say, well, Gettysburg's a turning point, but the war went on for another 20 months afterwards. Same with Vicksburg. So.
Yeah. So as we wrap up here, I want to give a shout out to Jim Lewis out at Stones River because he's just one of those great, fantastic gems working in the Park Service who has done so much to interpret and preserve and protect that battlefield. You want to give him a shout out as well?
Oh, absolutely. And congratulations. I think he got a new job. I really saw something on LinkedIn here the other day. So congratulations on the promotion. Jim was instrumental in helping me write this book. I showed up at Stones River 20 years ago. I wasn't. I was just I'll call him a punk kid researcher. that wanted to spend time in the Stones River Arc. Now the park has a incredible archive in the basement. I mean, just with thousands of documents. And I let Jim know what I wanted to do, and he assigned a ranger to help me. I think I made 3 trips, basically making copies of just mounds and mounds of documentation. And then he didn't hear anything from me for 15 years. So finally I came back and says, I'm finally going to write that Stones River book. And he graciously read as I was writing chapters, he was reading the manuscript and providing feedback.
Oh, wow.
And the book is better for his contribution. I'm very grateful. Yeah, great. I'm looking forward to seeing him on Monday.
Oh, well,
We
please
go
tell him I
down to
said hello.
the Franklin Civil War show this upcoming weekend, and
Oh, good.
a stop over at the park on Monday on the way home. So
Fantastic. Well, Dan, congratulations on a monumental book. And it's one of those campaigns that I think a lot of people sort of do skip over. And Dan's book is going to make it well worth stopping and paying attention and reading. You're going to want to go visit Stones River after you read this book if you have not. I'm super excited for you, Dan. This is a great book.
oh, thank you very much. It was a labor of love. I'm really I'm delighted that the book is out, and I'm just so humbled by the warm reception and your warm words. Thank you so much. And what I really hope is that as folks read this, I hope they have an emotional reaction to it. But I also want them to maybe help light the fire in the belly for preservation. You know, we think about the condition of the Stones River battlefield and you think, oh, all is lost. No, we've had some significant preservation victories there in the last year. That piece of property on Gresham Lane, I was super excited about, because finally it's like, well, we can start interpreting what happened in the opening moments of the battle on the ground that it happened. Now, granted, it's not a huge plot, but it's a start. And I still think that there are some land, especially west and north of the park, that there's still some potential. Hopefully, as people read this, they'll start better understanding what this battle really meant and what it was like, and why it's important for us to preserve this land, so not just for ourselves and our own enlightenment, but for our grandchildren as well. I mean, the Civil War is becoming really dim history for a lot of folks. I mean, we're 160 years past. Getting on the ground, you can start having those moments where you make those connections with history, which I think are so important.
A great
I
appendix
hope
in the
that's
book.
one of the effects of the book is not only that they just enjoy reading, enjoy learning about it, but it maybe provides a bit of something to chew on about. Well, maybe there's more we can do towards preservation there, which is very meaningful to me.
Yeah, a great appendix in the book that makes the case for preservation. So I appreciate you
you.
having that. All the
Thank
work
you.
that I do for preservation, I'm super glad that you made that case.
Thank you.
Dan, good luck, and please keep in touch. We'll be glad to have you on the program again. The work you're doing to share these stories, not just of the battle, but the stories of common soldiers, so important. Thanks for what you do, man.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here tonight.
I'm Chris Bukowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.